The drop pod smelled like hydraulic fluid and other people's fear. Sergeant Mara Voss had made exactly 11 combat drops. She knew the smell by now the way a baker knows yeast. Bone deep, involuntary, a thing the body recognized before the brain caught up. The soldier to her left was a kid named Okafor, 19 years old, and he was breathing through his nose in short, controlled bursts the way they'd been taught. The soldier to her right was Corporal Dante, done 23 drops and had stopped being afraid of the pod itself, somewhere around drop 8. He was afraid of other things now, better things, he said. More specific things. 20 seconds, said the pod speaker, in a voice that was carefully, deliberately calm. The Federation loved that voice, tested it in 17 focus groups. Mara checked her rifle for the 4th time. Safety, magazine, safety again. The rifle hadn't changed, it wouldn't change. She checked it anyway, because the checking was its own kind of prayer. The Veth didn't have gods. That was the first thing Command had told them when the contact was made. 14 months ago, in the outer belt of a system called HD 4307, where a survey ship had gone silent, and then very loudly not silent, in a way that killed all 41 people aboard. The Veth didn't have gods, didn't have art, didn't have music. What they had was a perfect, distributed intelligence, a hive mind spanning billions of individual bodies across 3 star systems. And they had been watching humanity build its little chain of colony worlds, the way a surgeon watches a patient's hand for signs of infection. They had decided humanity was an infection. 5 seconds. Okafor grabbed Mara's wrist. Not hard, just contact. She didn't shake him off. The pod hit atmosphere and everything became noise. The first wave at Kara 7 had been a disaster that Command was still trying to find the right word for. Not a defeat, not a setback. Something below language, something that happened when you sent 40,000 soldiers onto a planet surface and 14,000 came back. The feeds had shown the initial landing as a triumph, armor glinting in the alien sun. Voice of General Harrow reading from a prepared statement about humanity's resolve and the Federation's unbroken spirit. Then the Veth had come up from the ground. They didn't come from the sky. Nobody had expected that. The intelligence assessments, 200 pages dense with thermal readings and orbital observation data, had described the Veth as an aerial species, their cities built in towering spire clusters above the canopy. The assessments were not wrong. They were simply incomplete. Because the Veth, it turned out, also nested beneath the surface of every planet they occupied, in vast root systems of tunnel chambers that went down 4 kilometers. And when a force of 40,000 soldiers landed on their surface, they came up underneath them. Mara had not been at Karath 7. She had been on the troop carrier Hestia, 72 hours out, watching the feeds with 300 other soldiers who had been scheduled for the second wave. She remembered the moment the feeds cut out. She remembered the silence after. She remembered a private named Welch who had been sitting near her. A quiet kid from a farming settlement on Kepler 22b, who had enlisted because he'd been told the signing bonus would cover his mother's medical, putting his head down on the table and not lifting it again for a long time. Welch had died at Karath 9 4 months later. Mara still had the photograph he'd carried. She'd found it on the ground near where he fell, and she didn't know what else to do with it, so she kept it in her left breast pocket, which was where she kept things that mattered. The pod hit ground. Karath 11 was a smaller objective. That was what Command called it. A smaller objective, which was the Federation's way of saying that fewer people would die here than had died elsewhere, and that the deaths would be proportional to the strategic value of the target, as if dying could be made proportional to anything. The target was a Veth emergence cluster, 3 square kilometers of tunnel mouths, where they'd been sending bodies up for weeks, probing, testing the perimeter of the human firebase at Outpost Keller. Outpost Keller was a fortified position built in the ruins of a Veth surface structure, a thing of alien geometry that human hands had filled with sandbags and sensors, arrays, and the particular kind of desperate ingenuity that comes from knowing resupply is 6 weeks out. There were 212 soldiers at Keller when Mara's drop pod hit ground. There were also, according to the sensor logs that had been transmitted to her unit in the 40 minutes before ear insertion, somewhere between 8 and 12,000 Veth within striking range. 8 to 12,000. The math was bad. Mara was good at math. Rally on me, she said, because Dante was already moving, and Okafor was 3 steps behind her, and 6 more pods had hit the ground in the last 30 seconds. Soldiers spilling out into the gray-orange light of a planet that smelled faintly of copper, and something sweet she'd never been able to identify. The sweetness was the worst part. It made the whole thing feel wrong in a way the smell of blood didn't. Sergeant Heike from 3rd Squad materialized out of the settling dust. He had a long jaw and the permanent squint of a man who had spent his career looking into things he wished he hadn't. "Intel's wrong again," he said, which was not a question. "When isn't it?" said Mara. "They're already above ground. East perimeter. Keller's holding butt." The sound the Veth made was not a scream. It wasn't a roar. It was something between a frequency and a word. A vibration that lived in the chest cavity and the back teeth. And it came from everywhere at once. Because the Veth were everywhere at once. Because that was what a distributed intelligence meant in practice. No center, no weakness, no single thing you could shoot that would make the rest stop. "Move," said Mara. She had joined because of Buenos Aires. Not the city. Buenos Aires was not a city anymore, had not been a city for 11 months. Since the orbital strike had turned 300 square kilometers of the Argentine basin into a glass-smooth plain of fused earth and ash. 18 million people. The number was too large to hold. Mara had tried in the weeks after to hold it, to make herself feel the full weight of it, and she couldn't. The brain isn't built for 14 million. It's built for faces. Grandmother's face. That was what she held. Her grandmother had been 81 years old and had survived 2 relocations, 1 flood, and the slow unraveling of the city she'd grown up in. She'd had a way of humming when she cooked, half-remembered tunes, fractured into rhythm, melodies that had lost their words but kept their shape. Mara used to sit in the kitchen and listen, and never think to ask what the songs were called. There was always time to ask. And then there wasn't. She'd signed her enlistment papers 2 days after the strike. Recruiting officer had been kind enough not to smile when she slid the forms across the desk. There were 14 million reasons to fight. She was only using one of them. Outpost Keller was a fortress built by people who knew they were going to be outnumbered. That fact was written in every decision. The overlapping fields of fire, the sensor towers, staggered, so that no single strike could blind the whole perimeter, the underground bunkers where the wounded could be moved out of the line of fire. The soldiers who'd built it, the 2nd Recon Battalion, 8 months ago, before 2nd Recon had been reduced to a company and a half, had looked at the ground and looked at the numbers and built something that assumed the numbers were going to be bad. They were good at their jobs. Mara appreciated this as she sprinted across open ground toward the east wall with Dante at her shoulder and the sound of Veth emergence fire cutting the air in long iridescent bursts that smelled incongruously like ozone and rain. The Veth bioweapons were not guns. They were organs, evolved or cultivated over generations, that generated focused electromagnetic pulses wrapped in a physical projectile, a thing that was simultaneously a bullet and a lightning strike. It could punch through standard armor if the angle was right. It could set a soldier's nervous system stuttering like a bad electrical connection. It could also, under certain conditions, be reflected. Dante had figured that out at Karath 9, in the middle of a firefight, by accident. He had been hiding behind a piece of Veth architecture, a wall section of that strange crystalline material they grew rather than built, and a pulse round had hit the crystal and bounced sideways and taken out the shooter. Dante had filed a report. Command had filed the report in a folder. 12 weeks later, a materials team had reverse-engineered a coating for the forward face of infantry shields. Nobody had given Dante credit for this. He didn't care. He carried one of the shields now, matte gray and slightly curved, and he angled it while he ran, and 3 pulse rounds hit it in the next 8 seconds and went sideways into the ground. "Left," said Mara, and they went left, through a gap in the outer fortifications that had been a door once, in the alien structure's previous life, as whatever it had been before humanity had filled it with sandbags. Inside Keller, it was controlled chaos, which is what competent soldiers in an impossible situation look like from the outside. Medics moving, Squad leaders talking into comms. The particular economy of motion that comes from exhaustion and training, everything unnecessary has been stripped away, and what remains is pure function. A lieutenant named Orzak found her within 30 seconds. He had a bandage around his left forearm and the look of a man operating on no sleep and a great deal of purpose. Voss, good. Listen, we've got a problem. I noticed, not the assault. The assault we can handle. They're coming in waves, not a surge, which means they're being directed. Something's directing them. Mara absorbed this. A coordinator. They're calling it a Veth Prime. Intel started picking up a distinct signal pattern 3 days ago. Something that's not in any of the emergence cluster profiles. Larger, slower to move. It's been staying back behind the contact line, but the movements, Orzak pulled up a datapad, showed her a map. Every wave adjusts based on what the last wave learned. They're not swarming, they're analyzing. Mara looked at the map. The emergence clusters were arranged in a loose arc, east and south, and in the center of that arc, approximately 2 kilometers back from the contact line, there was a thermal signature that didn't match any Veth body type in the database. Massive. Nearly stationary. How many combat units does Keller have that can reach that position? Orzak's expression answered the question before he opened his mouth. Right, said Mara. She took 12 soldiers. She could have asked for more, but more soldiers meant more coordination, more noise, more time. Time was the thing they didn't have. She took 12 soldiers she knew, Dante, Okafor, Heike, and 9 others, whose faces and habits and combat rhythms she'd spent months learning, and she told Orzak what she was going to try to do. And he looked at her for a long moment and then nodded once, slowly. It was the military equivalent of saying that the plan was insane, and he couldn't think of a better one. They went out through the south wall, a drainage channel that the original builders had installed for some Veth purpose nobody had decoded, and moved low and fast through the copper-smelling undergrowth of Kareth 11's native flora, waist-high, blue-gray, tipped with structures that looked like seed pods, but weren't. Okafor had figured out the Veth detection patterns 2 weeks before the drop, a captured communications fragment that nobody in Signals had fully decoded yet. The Veth primes directing pulses, the signals that organized the waves, adjusted the assault patterns, processed the tactical data from the front line, also created a momentary dead zone in their ambient electromagnetic sensing. Roughly 4 seconds, every 32 seconds, like a heartbeat. 4 seconds where a small group of humans, moving fast and low, wouldn't register on whatever the Veth used instead of eyes. 4 seconds at a time, across 2 kilometers of alien terrain. This is a terrible plan, said Heike, low-moving. Said Mara. I've had worse plans, said Dante. When? I can't remember specifically, but statistically. They moved in silence for a moment. The sound of the assault on Keller was a continuous percussion behind them, punctuated by the crack of pulse rounds and the flat percussion of Federation ordnance. Mara did not let herself think about what was happening there. She thought about the next 4 seconds, and then the 4 seconds after that. This was the skill that nobody put on a recruiting poster, the ability to reduce the world to immediate geometry. The next 4 meters of ground, the next 4 seconds of window, everything else. The 14 million, the grandmother, the photograph in her breast pocket. Everything else goes into a room in the back of your head and you close the door. Not forever, just for now. Okafor counted quietly, counting the pulse cycle. Every 32 seconds, Mara said. Move, and they moved. They lost their first soldier at the 700-meter mark. Fit 10 had been second from the end of the line. A solid soldier from New Helsinki, who was reliable under fire and had a habit of annotating. Rifle's handguard with small marks she never explained. She was caught by a roving Veth scout, not a combat body, one of the smaller sensor forms that moved ahead of the lines. And the burst that hit her was not aimed, just a reflexive discharge. But it caught her in the neck and she was down before anyone could reach her. Mara grabbed Ten's rifle and kept moving. This was not coldness. This was the door in the back of your head. You close it and you keep moving, and the grief is still in there. It doesn't go away. You just make it wait. The second soldier was Private Asanti, 100 meters further on, when a section of ground gave way. Veth tunnel mouth, unmapped because of course it was, and he went down into it. He didn't make a sound. The tunnel closed. 10 soldiers left. How much further? Hake asked. 800 meters, said Mara. Maybe. And the plan when we get there? Mara had been thinking about this for the entire 2 kilometers. In the 4-second windows between counting, in the spaces between closing the door and reopening it. The problem with the Veth Prime was the same problem as the Veth in general. Distributed consciousness meant that killing one node didn't kill the network. The brain bugs on Karath 7, the term was commands, borrowed from an old flat-screen film that someone on the general staff had apparently loved. Could be injured, could be captured, but a dead Veth Prime just meant the nearest adjacent node absorbed its function. There was no head to cut off, but there was something else. A thing Okafor had noticed in the signal data that he'd mentioned almost as an afterthought during the briefing, the kind of observation a 19-year-old makes when he's trying to be thorough and doesn't yet know which observations matter. When the Veth Prime directed a wave and the wave failed, there was a pause before the next direction signal. A gap. The gap was small, less than 2 minutes, never quite the same length. But it was there, and it was consistent, and Okafor had theorized, hesitantly, that it represented something like recalibration. As if the failure of a wave generated a moment of, not confusion, exactly, more like reassessment. A mind confronting data that contradicted its model. Even a distributed intelligence, Okafor had said quietly, has to process something it didn't expect. Humanity had been doing things the Veth didn't expect for 11 months. They were getting better at it. They smelled the Veth Prime before they saw it. Not the copper sweetness of the terrain. Something older. Something that lived below language, that hit the limbic system directly and said, this thing is large and old, and does not think the way you think. The undergrowth thinned, and the thermal signature resolved from data point to physical reality. And the Veth Prime was present. It occupied space the way a mountain occupies space, not aggressively, simply by being too large to pretend away. It was roughly spherical, the size of a large transport vehicle, segmented and pale, suspended in a lattice of Veth biostructure that pulsed with slow bioluminescent rhythm. Around it in a loose orbit, moved 20-odd Veth combat bodies, not engaged, not in attack posture, moving the way guards move when they are confident, alert but unhurried 20 guards. 10 humans. Ideas, said Mara very quietly. Not a question. Dan Fati was already looking at the biostructure lattice. He had the expression he got when he was about to say something that would sound stupid for about 30 seconds and then turn out to be the only viable option. Mara had learned to recognize that expression. The lattice, he said. The same crystal composite the walls are made of. If we hit it from the right angle, the pulse rounds reflect off it, said Mara. It's not reflective at every angle, but at roughly 30 degrees of incidence, we'd need them to shoot at us first. Yes. A silence. That's the plan, said Heike. That's most of the plan, said Dan T. Mara looked at the lattice. She looked at the 20 guards. She looked at the Veth Prime, massive and old and slow, processing the incoming tactical data from the assault on Keller with the patient, distributed confidence of something that had never lost a war. She thought about Okafor's observation, about the pause, the moment of recalibration when something unexpected happened. Okafor, she said. The signal pattern. When does the next direction pulse go out? He checked his wrist unit. 40 seconds. Maybe 50. And if the wave at Keller fails before it goes out, then the prime has to recalibrate. 2 minutes, maybe less, before the next directive. And during those 2 minutes the guards would still be receiving the old directive. Position. Until new orders come. Mara pulled up her comms. Orzak was still on the channel, voice clipped and tight, managing the assault on Keller from the inside of it. Orzak, she said, I need the East Wall team to break the current wave. Completely. Right now. In the next 30 seconds. Make it look like a rout. Pull back. Let them advance, then hit them with everything. I need a total wave failure. Pause. The sound of a firefight behind his voice. Voss, I've got 212 people holding this position. I know. I'm sorry. Seconds. Another pause, shorter. You'd better be right. I'm usually right about the part that matters, she said. The rest I improvise. She clicked off the channel and turned to her 10 soldiers. She could see on their faces what she needed to see. Not confidence, not certainty. That specific hardness, that forms when someone has decided they're going to do the thing in front of them, regardless of what it costs. When the next wave fails and the prime goes silent, she said the guards will hold. We have maybe 90 seconds before new orders come. We go in, we use Dante's angle on the lattice, and we make a lot of noise. What we're trying to do is not kill it. A dead prime just gets replaced. What we're trying to do is make it process something it has never had to process before. Which is, said Heike. Mara reached into her chest pocket. Photograph. Welch's mother smiling in front of a farmhouse on Kepler 22b, squinting into the light of a sun 3 times farther from Earth than Earth is from its own. She put it back. Fear, she said. We're going to make it afraid. The east wall lit up. Mara heard it from 2 kilometers away, the sound of Keller collapsing its perimeter, deliberately, pulling back, the chaos of a controlled retreat that looked like a rout from the outside. She heard the Veth advance, that sub-frequency sound, that vibration in the chest, and she heard Federation ordnance open up from 3 directions. At once, a crossfire that had been pre-positioned and pre-aimed and pre-waiting for exactly this moment. The wave didn't just fail, it collapsed, and the Veth Prime went quiet. Not physically quiet. It was still there, still breathing in its slow bioluminescent rhythm. The signal Okafor was tracking on his wrist unit dropped to nothing, and the 20 guards stopped their orbital movement and simply held, waiting for the directive that wasn't coming. Now, said Mara. They went in fast, splitting into 4 groups, and Heike's group reached the lattice first and didn't wait to be shot at. Heike put a round into the lattice at the wrong angle and watched it dissipate and swore and adjust and put the next one at 28 degrees, and the round came off the lattice surface and went sideways and took guard 20 meters away, clean, sudden, and then the guards were no longer holding position because something had happened that the directive hadn't accounted for. The Veth combat bodies moved to respond, and Dante was already using his shield, angling it. 2 pulse rounds came off it at 30 degrees and found their sources. And Okafor, 19 years old, 3 months in the field, a kid from a colony world who'd enlisted because somebody he loved needed something he didn't have. Okafor had figured out on the flight in that if you fed the Prime Zone signal back to it at the right frequency, amplified through a repurposed comms unit, stripped down to its carrier wave, it would register as a second prime attempting to override it. Not enough to shut it down, not enough to do real damage, enough to make it hesitate. He hit the button on the modified unit and the Veth Prime's bioluminescence stuttered. 1 second. 2. The lattice shuddered. 3 of the guards pivoted away from the humans entirely, facing inward, responding to the phantom signal. 90 seconds. They were at 60 and counting. Mara was at the base of the lattice underneath the prime, and she looked up at the thing, at its slow alien breathing, at the way it hung in the lattice like something between a brain and a star. And she did the thing she always did in the moments when the world reduced to its essential geometry. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of it, the sound of half-remembered tunes, fractured into rhythm, melodies that had lost their words but kept their shape. She hummed, very quietly, the fragment she remembered best, while she positioned the charges. 3 soldiers lost on the way in, 7 remaining. Dante was down to 4 shields from 6. Heike had a gash across his forearm from a pulse round that had reflected at a bad angle and caught him at the seam of his armor. Nobody complained. There wasn't time for it. The charges were shaped to blow inward and upward, not to kill the prime, which would have taken 4 times the ordnance they were carrying, but to damage the lattice support structures and force the prime to relocate, to break the communication geometry it had spent weeks establishing, to make it go through the process of rebuilding its tactical network from a new position. It wouldn't end the war. It wouldn't save the 14 million who were already gone. It was a small thing tactically, a disruption, a delay. The delay would let resupply reach Keller. The resupply would let Keller hold. Keller holding would give command time to bring in the interdiction platforms that could start hitting the emergence clusters from orbit. The cascade of events laid out in the mission briefing, like dominoes, all depended on this moment, this small, specific, human act of reaching into the enemy's most protected position and leaving something behind. 60 seconds, said Dante. Set, said Mara. She had set the last charge. The Prime's bioluminescence changed. She felt it before she understood it. A shift in the rhythm, the slow pulse accelerating, the color shifting from blue-white towards something in the amber range that Okafor's data had flagged as an agitation response. The recalibration was complete. New orders were coming. Out, she said. They ran. The thing about running away from an explosion is that it feels exactly like running away from everything else. Which is to say, you don't feel legs. You don't feel the ground. You only feel the forward direction and the thing behind you that you're trying to put distance. Between yourself and Mara's world was the next meter of ground, and the next, and the next. Heike was 3 steps to her right, Dante 2 steps ahead. Okafor was behind her and she could hear him, which meant he was still there. The charges blew. She felt it before she heard it. A compression wave that pushed her forward and sideways, and the sound came half a second later, massive and flat, and then a second sound that was the lattice structure collapsing, and a third sound that was new. Something the Veth made when the Prime was moved, against its will, a frequency that wasn't pain exactly, because pain was a biological concept, and the Veth's relationship to individual sensation was complicated by distribution, but that lived in the same register. A sound of disruption, of the model contradicted. The guards, deprived of a directive for the second time in 90 seconds, did the only thing they could. They went to the Prime. 12 of them turned inward to protect it, which meant 8 of them were still tracking the humans. Still, from 20, they were down to 8. The math was getting better. Contact right, said Dante, and Mara went left, using the undergrowth, using the alien blue-gray vegetation and its seed pod tips, using the darkness of Karath 11's early evening as it settled over them like a hand. Pulse rounds lit the air. Pike went down. Not dead, she could hear him cursing, and she went back for him and pulled, and Dante covered, and Okafor was still counting the pattern, calling the windows. Now, said Okafor. 3 seconds. They moved. 3 seconds. Now, they moved. 3 seconds. 4, 5, 6 windows, and the pursuit was falling behind. The Veth guards not pursuing in a pattern she could predict, because the Prime was not sending coherent directives yet, was still rebuilding its network geometry, and without coherent directives, the individual combat bodies were running their default hunting algorithms, which were effective, but not adaptive. Humans were adaptive. Humans were, in fact, pathologically adaptive. They would do things that made no survival sense. Go back for someone, change the plan in the middle, blow up a lattice with 7 people, and improvised ordnance. Because adaptation, in the human species, had never been purely about individual survival. It was about the unit, about the person next to you, about the photograph in your breast pocket that you can't explain to anyone, but that you carry, because the carrying matters even when the person is gone. They came back into Keller through the south drainage channel, the same way they'd gone out, and the first person Mara saw on the other side was Orzak, who looked at her 7 soldiers. Pike limping, Dante's shields in pieces, For's comm unit sparking from a bad pulse-round proximity hit, and said nothing for a moment. The east wall's holding, he said finally. Signal dropped. Completely, about 4 minutes ago. They're not coordinating anymore. The contact line pulled back. Not a lot. He paused. They pulled back. Mara thought about the sound the Prime had made when the lattice came down. Frequency that lived in the register of disruption. It's afraid, she said. Orzak looked at her. It's analyzing the data from the last 2 hours, she said that. It's built its model of what humans do in impossible situations and we just gave it something it doesn't have a category for. It'll find a category eventually. It'll adapt. But right now it's thinking, said Orzak. Now it's thinking. That 2-minute gap. That pause between the failure and the next directive. She'd exploited it tactically. She'd also seen something in it that she couldn't quite articulate yet. Something about what it meant that even a distributed intelligence, mind spanning 3-star systems and billions of bodies, had a moment of stillness when it encountered something it hadn't predicted, something it had no framework for. The Veth had been watching humanity colonize for 40 years. Had watched them build and expand and argue and vote on things and fail and start over and fail again and not stop. Had watched them send survey ships into unmapped systems and lose those ships and send more. Had watched them build a city and watch it burn and build another city in the same place. Had watched all of that, and still, apparently, not fully accounted for what it meant. The prime signal came back online 2 hours later. Okafor was tracking it, had his unit rebuilt with parts from a dead soldier's kit. Because that was what Okafor did. He fixed things. And when it came back, it was different. The wave pattern was different. The timing was different. The Veth were adapting, but so were they. The resupply drop came 17 hours later, ahead of schedule, because Command had received Mara's field report and made a decision she hadn't anticipated. They bumped the priority. 2 full companies. Fresh equipment. The interdiction platforms that could start hitting the emergence clusters from high atmosphere. The tide didn't turn. Tides don't turn in 17 hours. And anyone who'd been at Karth 7 knew better than to think in terms of turning. But shifted. Fractionally, perceptibly, Keller held. In the weeks that followed, the analysts at Command did a deep dive on the Prime's signal data from that night. The 43 minutes of disruption that Mara's team had generated, and they found the gap, studied it, started calling it the hesitation window, which became standard doctrine inside of 6 months. That a Veth Prime, when confronted with a sufficiently unexpected action, would pause for between 140 and 210 seconds before issuing the next directive, and that this pause could be exploited, leveraged, used as a tactical resource, the way any other temporary advantage could be used. Doctrine called for small, fast units, high improvisation profiles, operations designed around unpredictability rather than force superiority. They even gave it a classification code. Mara never used it. She just called it the plan. The terrible, improvised, statistically improbable plan that she'd made up in a drainage channel on a planet that smelled of copper and something sweet. She was given a commendation, which she accepted politely and put in a drawer. She was promoted, she accepted, and used immediately to advocate for better resupply intervals. She was asked, in a recorded session for the Federation's Tactical Archive, to describe the moment when she decided to go for the Prime. She thought about it for a while. It was the math, she said finally. The math was bad, and we did it anyway, because the alternative was to let the math win. And humans, she paused. Humans are terrible at accepting that the math wins. We've always been terrible at it. We just keep trying things, even when the math is bad, especially when the math is bad. The interviewer asked if she thought that was a strength or a flaw. Mara thought about her grandmother, about the songs that kept their shape after the words were gone, about Welch's photograph, still in her breast pocket. She'd never taken it out, had just started thinking of it as part of the uniform, and about Okafor's quiet, hesitant observation about the gap in the signal, the thing he'd almost not said because he wasn't sure it mattered. Both, she said. It's both. Okafor made Sergeant 7 months later. Mara was there for the ceremony, which was held in what remained of the main hall of Outpost Keller, rebuilt now, expanded, permanent installation rather than a temporary hold. And she watched him accept the rank, and she didn't say anything sentimental because that wasn't her register, but she shook his hand and held it a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and that was enough. Heike was there too. His arm healed but the nerve damage permanent, which meant he'd lost 2 of the finer grip functions in his left hand. He was still in service. He'd applied for reassignment to a training role and been accepted and had subsequently declined it and remained in the field because Heike was like that. Dan T had been rotated back to Earth for a skills assessment cycle. He sent Mara a message from Buenos Aires, from the edge of what the Federation had taken to calling the recovery zone, broad barren expanse of fused Earth that used to be a city. And the message just said, "It's a big hole. I thought you should know I came to look at it." She wrote back, "Good." She meant something by that. She thought he understood what she meant. The war didn't end cleanly or quickly. Wars don't. The Veth adapted to the hesitation window doctrine within 8 months, found ways to shorten the gap, began incorporating deliberate unpredictability into their own wave patterns. The Federation adapted to that adaptation. The Veth adapted again. It went back and forth as these things do, each side pressing at the edges of what the other side had thought was fixed. But there was a thing that had happened on Karth 11 that couldn't unhappen. The Veth Prime had been afraid. Not for long. Not in a way that changed its fundamental nature. But the signal data was there. The frequency analysis was there. And the analysts who'd spent their careers mapping Narloj Golf's mapping and said with high confidence that what they were seeing in those 3 minutes of data was a response they'd never recorded before. A distributed intelligence confronting something outside its model, processing a universe that had declined to cooperate with its analysis. The Federation turned it into a propaganda piece, because of course they did. Recruiting ad. The words played over footage of soldiers in armor, faces obscured, doing the things soldiers do in recruiting ads. Mara watched it once, in the comment room of a transport vessel, and turned it off before it was done. What was true about it was still true without the music. The things that were too small for the ad, the counting, the 4-second windows, improvised comms unit that Okafor rebuilt from salvage, the way Heike adjusted the angle of his rifle in real time, based on what was working and wasn't, the photograph in a breast pocket, the fragment of a song without words. Those things were not poster material. They were not quotable. They were not the shape of a story that anyone wanted to tell about a war. But they were what the thing had actually been. Of people in a drainage channel in the dark, on a planet that smelled sweet and wrong, counting to 4, moving, counting again, making it up as they went, carrying the specific weight of specific faces and moving anyway, and not stopping, and not letting the math win. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. It was a terrible plan. It kept working.